Well, one more time, we were abruptly interrupted here talking about Jean-Paul Marat, one of the many crazy leaders that rose to power in the radical phase of the revolution. But Marat was just talking about the famous painting on the right by Jacques-Louis David called The Death of Marat, who paints, this is one of the great paintings of the 18th century in Europe by one of the great painters, but David painted him as a revolutionary martyr, as a hero, this fanatical, bloodthirsty politician and editor. If you look at the painting itself, I won't get into it too much here, but just the way his sort of body is lying, it has sort of a Christ on the cross look to it, and that was surely intentional. And he's doing work in the bathtub. That's the bathtub that he's in. He was actually stabbed to death in the bathtub by a woman, average woman who talked her way into his lodgings and into the bathroom. He did a lot of his work in the tub, and she murdered him with a knife. Forget what her excuse for being there was. She was appalled by the orgy of violence that was taking place by this time in France, and for some reason got into her head that if she killed him, it would sort of end the whole thing, which of course wasn't true. No, it wasn't true because the revolution went on. Nonetheless, David was one less maniac out of the way, though that was crazy on her part to do what she did. So by making him look like a workaholic and Jesus Christ on the cross, it's not that subtle that Jacques-Louis David is in sympathy with Marat. And truth be told, David himself in time got elected to the revolutionary legislature and became a politician of the hard left Jacobin type. So not surprising then when we learn that he painted a picture of one of his fellow Jacobins. Oh, by the way, Marat, I think I mentioned this before, it's worth repeating, he was one of those Jacobins behind some of the massacres and violence we saw in 1792. So this was a matter of time, I think, after the flight from Varennes, and between then and now, there was a great deal of debate and political discussion about what are we going to do about the monarchy? What are we going to do about Louis XVI? So it didn't come automatically, or didn't come suddenly, but it was in September of 1792 where the National Convention took the further step of abolishing the monarchy and establishing a republic, the first republic of France, not the last, in that same year. So far so good? No? Was this not? No. Was this not a positive step for the country? A move from an absolute monarchy to a republican system of government? On the surface, the answer seems to be a clear yes, and it might be anyway. But I think it's worth thinking about the possibility that just because something is a monarchy, called a monarchy, doesn't necessarily mean it's better than, an improvement over, something that's at least in name called a republic. Keep in mind, this republic is one that's already led by leaders that have a slipping grasp of reality, or at least a slipping grasp, if any, on morality and legality. So there are republics and there are republics. This isn't the healthiest of them from the very beginning. Our republic, meaning the one in the U.S., that began around this same time, was a much, much healthier, real republic from the start. And I don't say that just because I'm an American, it's true. So this isn't necessarily a step up. We'll see something similar later in the class. World War I brought the Habsburg Empire down. And you think, okay, well, it's a monarchy, an absolute monarchy at that. like this one, taken down by the war and replaced by mostly democracies in now break up fragmented pieces of the Habsburg Empire into modern, mostly democratic countries. That's a step in the right direction. Well, again, in theory, but what happened to those countries? Hitler overran all of them because it was a smaller. Right, they were broken into pieces now, so it's worth the sort of the counterfactual what if questions. What if the Habsburg monarchy had stayed alive? Would Hitler have been able to do what he did by picking on one smaller country at a time? The answer could be yes. We'll never know, since the Austrian Habsburgs were already weakening in power by the time. But it could have been something different. At least it would have been a united, much larger political system and, military that Hitler would have to contend with, not separate, smaller, break-off chunks of what it had once been. To show us how radical this revolution and revolutionary group was, how much they were trying to totally change the system, they dug deep into French culture and tried to change, sort of root out not just the political system, political institutions, but the social institutions, the culture as well. And the most straightforward example is this one. They changed the calendar. They changed all the names of the months, and sort of they changed, and they made the first day of the new revolutionary calendar, September 22nd, 1792, and that year into year one. So it's as if they were, and in some ways were, trying to, and sometimes they were, in some ways they were trying to erase all of the years before that. We don't need to even name those any longer. This is year one. Yeah, but what about all those thousands of years before? It doesn't matter. This is year one. So they're trying to culturally, as well as politically, cut off and discard their past. This is something that isn't done that often. Usually it's in totalitarian systems of the extreme right or extreme left, and this is basically the first one of the latter. So it fits, again, the overall pattern. So this is radical social engineering, which is what totalitarian systems of either side of the political spectrum do. This is drastically trying to change everything about the society. If everything we've talked about so far isn't already wild enough, if it's not already confusing enough to you, and by the way, don't blame me for that, blame the French Revolution. It's confusing. It was confusing. It is confusing. We see a counter-revolution that rose up in a place called the Vendée, western part of France. If you can picture a map of France, perhaps you can, perhaps you can't, there's a part of the western France that kind of juts out into the Atlantic Ocean, kind of like a point. That's where the Vendée is. And there was a particular concentration of pro-monarchy, pro-Louis XVI sentiment there amongst peasant farmers. So under nobles and wealthy, powerful leaders who were trying to end this revolution, trying to take it down, they put together a army of tens of thousands of mostly peasants who actually shouldered weapons, went onto the field, and fought revolutionary troops. The government was actually forced to send tens of thousands of troops of their own to the western part of France, to the Vendée, to put this down. It was a major civil war. So with everything else on their plate already, now they have to contend with, the revolutionary government that is, a civil war of major proportions in their own country. They're still fighting the foreign war. They're still trying to root out domestic enemies at home, trying to figure out who's on their side, who's not. That is rapidly getting harder and harder to sort out as well, and they become paranoid about that. But this civil war, when all was said and done, between 1793 and 96, saw 200,000 killed on both sides and 40,000 executed. Most of those were on the rebel side fighting against the revolution. Rebel captives were often killed, I'm reading from my own words here, but in large groups locked below deck in barges that were then sunk into the Loire River. So not a pretty picture, to put it mildly. So as Professor Davidson says, there was a big split in the country between supporters of the revolution and royalist sympathizers, especially peasants in the West. But why would a peasant be loyal to the monarchy at this point? Isn't it the peasants who were, aggrieved the most? Wasn't it the peasants that were suffering the most? So the burden of overwork and small amounts of land and no opportunity for advancement and overtaxation. Yes, 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 yes. However, people's economic lives, their income, their status economically, isn't the only element of political beliefs. I think this is something that is often not recognized today, and it should be. We often hear people say, well, this group of people votes against their own political interests or economic interests. Well, that could be true, and I think in some ways it is true in the present day of certain groups. But what's not usually considered is that again, they have other things to consider, and they have other values of importance besides just sort of economic ones. So cultural values, for instance, sometimes in people's minds are more important, right? Things cultural are more important than economic. And if they have to choose between one or the other, which then they probably wouldn't want to have to, they'll choose to emphasize, accentuate the cultural over the economic. I'm not saying all people do that, but some. So this is something similar here. Peasants, right? We know this from the beginning of our class. So we talked about the scientific revolution, the great chain of being, which gave some semblance of stability and feeling of order, and again some actual order. So peasants are loyal to the system in part because it's what they know, it's what they've taught to respect. People in rural areas, this is true even today, tend to be more apt to value authority, tradition, more than sort of people living in urban areas. So peasants were, by nature in a sense, or by culture, I guess, conservative. So not all of them rose up against the monarchy. Some of them stayed loyal, and we see it particularly in the Vendée. So in the end, it shouldn't really be that surprising, though it certainly seems like it when you first hear it. The conflict in the Vendée may be the most violent and bloody, I guess it is, the numbers, of all of the elements of this revolution. Is maybe the best example of all. I mean, there's other examples, we've already been through some of them, but I use this one because it's just so bloody. But how a revolution of this type, again sort of the left-leaning socialist type, can turn to utter fanaticism and irrational, gratuitous violence, always in the name of righteousness. We're doing the right thing. This is moral. And the leaders usually believe it. They're true believers in this case. So they're not just saying that, hey, we're killing all these people because it's going to bring about a better world, a better society. They actually believe it. Those types of people are scarier than those who don't believe it, in my opinion, because they're willing to go to any length necessary because they believe in their own goodness, in their own righteousness. This is so important for humanity, what I'm doing, what we're doing, that we might have to kill thousands and thousands of people. That's what they're saying. Some of the statements from leaders, both political and military leaders, dealing with the civil war in the Vendée, this is a hodgepodge of different statements by different people. We must take measures to exterminate the rebel race. Since this is a war of brigands, we must become brigands ourselves. We must, for a time, forget all military rules. Another, women, priests, monks, men, and children, all were put to death. I took no prisoners. Again, we can only defeat the Vendée by destroying it. And finally, I know there may be a few patriots left in this area. It doesn't matter. They must all be sacrificed. Coming from a tremendous book about this conflict, or the whole French Revolution, but a big section on the Civil War in the Vendée called The First Total War by David Bell. So the Vendée really, maybe more than anything else, in my view, exposes this connection between self-righteous certitude on one side of the cause, in the cause, and willingness to do whatever is necessary, even extremes of violence, to bring about the better world. Speaking of true believers trying to bring out a better world, and self-righteously engaging in large-scale violence, the absolute apex of this is the rise to power of Maximilien Robespierre, the person rightfully most associated with the overindulgences of the French Revolution in the radical phase. The Republic of Virtue, we see he coined this phrase and sort of tried to make the whole enterprise sound extremely noble. We've already seen in numerous slides, numerous parts of this lecture, that calling this revolution by now virtuous is a stretch, to put it mildly. But again, as a true believer, he appears to have actually believed that this was all going to bring about a better world in the end. So what explains his pitiless resort to mass violence? Was it just who he always was? Right? Was he just sort of that way from birth or childhood? Did the pressures of revolution change him? So was he a normal guy at the beginning of the revolution? Maybe when he first entered the National Assembly in 1789, which he did as a young politician. Maybe he was a normal guy, didn't have a tendency towards murderous impulses. Is there something about this kind of regime that raised people, whether innately or environmentally motivated, like this to the top? That's a possibility as well. And those are actually kind of scary questions to dig into. Again, I won't for reasons of time, but it is, I think, important food for thought. Particularly the last question, I think, is certainly worthy of ruminating about. If the basis of popular government in peacetime is virtue, he said, this is Robespierre's own words, the basis of popular government during a revolution is both virtue and terror. Virtue, without which terror is baneful. Terror, without which virtue is powerless. Terror is nothing more than speedy, severe, and inflexible justice. It is thus an emanation of virtue. It is less a principle in itself than a consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to the most pressing needs of the patrie, which means sort of the people in a romantic kind of sense. So this is his single most famous written statement, equating virtue and terror, right? You need both together because they're mutually reinforcing to each other. If there's no virtue that you're defending or promoting, then terror can't be justified. But he's saying if it's a virtuous cause, then it's totally justified. So this is just the language used to explain what we talked about moments ago. By the way, I think I mentioned this in class already. Sorry. I'll turn that page back for you. Remember that Robespierre's philosopher, intellectual of choice was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Not a surprise at all. So, what sometimes is called the Regicide Republic, the First Republic of France, had some leftover business still with regard to the old form of government, and that was what to do with the king. He'd already been stripped of his crown, and the monarchy was already gone, replaced by a republic, but he was still around. But he had been imprisoned. Well, they figured out what to do with him. There was eventually a trial. He was found guilty, of course. The guilty verdict was a foregone conclusion, and was executed on January 21st, 1793, by guillotine, which you see on the right. The machine that chopped people's heads off. By the way, the guillotine was considered at the time, and I'm not joking, was considered at the time the humane way to execute someone. Humane. Well, if we're comparing it to like being, the alternative being having your head chopped off with an axe, it is a humane improvement. But it shows how those things are all relative. So we might wonder and think, well, lethal injection, will they be looking back 100, 200 years from now and saying they actually thought in 2020 or whenever that lethal injection was a humane way to execute someone? Maybe there's no humane way to execute someone. I don't know. But Louis XVI was now being called Louis Capet, which was his last name. But why are they calling him Louis Capet? Well, it's sort of meant as an insult, and it's meant to show you're not the king any longer. You're not Louis XVI. You're just a guy with a first name and a last name. Sorry, you're just a citizen now. So this was to strip him of any semblance of his former power and sort of the former awe in which many Frenchmen held him, and maybe still did. Robespierre famously said, "Louis must die so that the country may live." And after the trial was over, the guilty verdict was unanimous, which is incredible. But the vote for what the punishment would be, execution, was close. In fact, they took a few votes. This was I think the third and final one, 380 to 310, and there were some that voted for kind of in between things measures. So this wasn't the total, but it's the yes for execution on the left, no in the minority, 310 on the right. So on January 21st, 1793, Louis went to the scaffold in what is now the Place de la Concorde, next to the empty pedestal of his grandfather's triumphal statue, his last professions of innocence drowned out by rolling drums. And as so often happens in regicide, the crowd on hand maybe hoping to be or thinking they're going to be gleeful when they see the execution happen, is often sort of stunned by silence, or even sort of moans and groans go up, although there was, I'm sure, some cheering as well. The Republican Revolution, brewing since Varenne, reached its logical climax, as William Doyle says in the Oxford History of the French Revolution. The destruction of the Ancien Regime, or the old regime, was surely now complete. Total. There could be no going back. Well, there's no getting Louis XVI's head back, that's for sure. But it's also true that there was no way, everyone knew it, I said this at the outset today, to pre-French revolutionary status. There's no way. This changed France, and really, in time, Europe, irrevocably. Doyle goes on to say the blood of the most Christian king, as the French king had been long called, offered defiance to all who questioned the French Revolution's achievements or its direction. So in some ways this is a defiant statement by Robespierre and his fellow Jacobin leadership, in saying, we don't care what the rest of Europe thinks, what its crowned heads think in Austria, Prussia, Russia. We're going through with this, and there would be a price to pay for that as well, and Napoleon would be the one that really felt sort of that price. From here, because the government was sort of penned in on many sides, partly of its own doing, but nonetheless under lots of pressure, a fateful decision was made. The convention, the politicians, agreed to put power in the hands of a small group, centralized power, so things could be done, at least in theory, more effectively. Our lovable author Professor Perry says in June 1793, the Jacobins replaced the Girondins as the dominant group in the National Convention. The Girondins favored a government in which the departments would exercise control, meaning decentralized power spread out. Like today, it'd be like at the state level instead of the federal government in Washington, D.C. Over their own departments would exercise control over their own affairs. The Jacobins wanted a strong central government with Paris as the center of power. The Jacobins supported temporary governmental controls to deal with the needs of war and economic crisis. This won them the support of the sans-culottes, which we already know they kind of had. This won further support from the sans-culottes. Perry goes on to say, all these are quotes from our text, the problems confronting the Jacobins were staggering. They had to cope with civil war in the Vendée, economic distress, the economic problems that go back to the end of the monarchy, Louis XVI, are still there. They haven't had time to deal with them because they've been, again, so ambitious in everything they're taking on. Ports were blockaded by foreign powers, Great Britain especially. A foreign invasion, we know, by multiple countries, Austria, Prussia, and they live with the terrible dread that if they failed, the revolution for liberty and equality would perish, which kind of pushed them, I think, further to extremes. In their view, only strong leadership could save the Republic. It was provided by the Committee of Public Safety. As it says at the top, a euphemism if there ever was one. The Committee of Public Safety. It was a committee, and I guess it was public, but safety, no. Serving as a cabinet for the convention, composed of 12 ardent and able patriots, they imposed the central government's authority throughout the nation. So in some ways this is kind of unofficial or temporary, at least supposed to be, but nonetheless led by Robespierre, this committee of all committed Jacobins then takes control of the revolution into the hands of a few instead of the elected legislature. Robespierre and the committee demanded conformity and punished dissenters. The revolution has been moving in that direction already anyway, going back to the formation of the Jacobin clubs and a more and more staunch, unrelenting, uncompromising Jacobin ideology. The revolution gone mad, with Robespierre at the head of the Committee of Public Safety, feeling the heat from many different directions, fearing the revolution may fail, and it could have. They believed they had to take extreme measures, and they did indeed. So we're now just getting to the most violent stage of the revolution, if you can believe that, the Reign of Terror. And as one contemporary at the time said, heads fell like slates from roofs. So the guillotine had already been used quite a bit during this revolution, but here it went into action. There was more than one guillotine, by the way, and in many different cities, but thousands of executions here. These were show trials for the most part, sped up by the law of suspects, a revolutionary tribunal that was actually the main instrument of the terror. So a law was sort of pushed through that sped up trials. I forget the judge's name, the main judge in Paris, but it was a joke. They basically just be brought in, the defendant, how do you plead? Not guilty. Well, we find you guilty, and the punishment is execution, and let him out and have him guillotined. Pretty much that. So there was no justice here. There was no real trial. And to show how dangerous this revolution was, the Girondins, many of their leaders, including Jacques Brousseau, went to the scaffold during the Reign of Terror and were executed. And the Girondins and their fall from political power and the severing of their heads, taken from their rest of their body, was just the beginning of the terror. But this applies to what we said earlier about Brousseau, the Girondins, at the time being the most radical group, and about how revolutions like this tend to eat their young. At one point, Jacques Brousseau was a hero of the revolution, only to be outflanked and out-radicalized, out-lefted, to make up my own term, by Robespierre and the Jacobins, so much so that they were now, by this time, considered, at least by revolutionaries, card-carrying ones, enemies of the revolution. And they were subject to the terror as well. They were actually its first major victims. About 500,000 arrested in the period of about a year, 16,000 executed, 20,000 people died in prison under extremely horrible conditions. Among many notable figures guillotined, Marie Antoinette followed her husband, Louis Philippe, Duc d'Orléans, another member of the family, royal family, Georges Danton, a fellow Jacobin, Jacques Hébert, right? The two guys that were Jacobins competing for the support of the masses, of the sans-culottes. They both go to the scaffold as well. Camille Desmoulins, one of the major leaders, also card-carrying revolutionary for a time. The Marquis de Condorcet, a leftover, still alive from the Enlightenment, an Enlightenment thinker, went to the guillotine. Antoine Lavoisier, a famous scientist, accomplished scientist in France, and many, many other noted figures. Lots of nobles that hadn't left yet lose their heads. And in this case, I don't mean figuratively, I do mean literally. And poetic justice, I suppose, but Robespierre was more or less next. And so were his fellow, many of the members of the Committee of Public Safety. One of them being a guy named Saint Just, young guy, frighteningly fanatical. And some of his statements are terrifying to behold. Lots of violent language and imagery. But Saint Just was one of the members of the committee, along with Robespierre. But how did he get executed, Robespierre? How did the committee get overturned? Well, and I put it in very gauche terms here to make it simple. Look at all the empty seats. We're going to be next. So picture it this way. As the National Convention meets each day, there are more and more empty seats, and we know why. Right? People are being denounced for one reason or another as enemies of the state, enemies of the revolution, and being given a show trial and executed. By the way, to show us how much out of hand these kind of revolutions get, some people were guillotined for personal reasons. So you could go and denounce your you could go denounce your landlord, for instance. Say, yeah, I heard my landlord, go to the authorities. I heard my landlord last night talking about a counter-revolutionary plot that he was involved in. And that might get him arrested and executed. I don't have to pay him rent any longer because he's dead. So some of this stuff became personal. A lot of paybacks going on as well. Political, personal paybacks, revenge, envy. So it wasn't just politics. So look at all the empty seats. We're going to be next means these guys are sitting around day after day seeing their colleagues fall one after another after another. And on a given day, this is true, many of the remaining members were in their seats, and Robespierre and the other members of the committee hadn't arrived yet. So they started a conversation. I don't know what the actual wording was, but it was something like, again, to keep my very crude way of saying it alive, look around. We're going to be next. It's obvious. One or more of us are going down. Who's left? So we got to do something. We have something in common, and that is Robespierre is endangering all of our lives, and the rest of the Committee of Public Safety as well. We need to do something about them, and they were able to informally, casually, fairly quickly get a number of soldiers, guards, posted to guard the legislature to arrest them when they came in. I don't know how they pulled that off, but they did. And sure enough, Robespierre, who seems to have been caught unawares, was captured. He actually escaped later that day and was found at the Paris Commune and taken into custody again. Wasn't exactly the smartest place to go because it was pretty predictable. His kind of original power center on his way up in the radical part of the revolution. They actually broke his jaw, I think, really bad. I think it was a gunshot when he was trying to escape, hit him in the jaw, and he lived. And they executed him the next morning, but he spent the night in agony, apparently, with a gunshot wound to the jaw. And I never advocate violence against anybody. At least I don't revel in it against anybody, and I don't even hear. But nonetheless, there you could say, of course, there was some poetic justice in this, as Robespierre right, went to the scaffold, was guillotined himself. So, as Professor Perry says, as the need and enthusiasm for the terror abated, Robespierre's political position weakened. Opponents in the convention, feeling the chill of the guillotine blade on their own necks, ordered the arrest of Robespierre and some of his supporters, and he was guillotined the next day. He just says it a little more smoothly than I do. So, the public is now starting to sour, imagine that, on massive, irrational violence that often netted innocent people like themselves, and this helps lead to the Thermidorian reaction in the latter half of 1794. So this represents the terror coming to an end, and the Jacobin clubs closed, churches reopened. So it's kind of a more sane group that now takes power. They oust the Jacobins, kind of back to kind of a moderate, revolutionary type government that becomes the Directory pretty quickly, known as the Directory. So back to some kind of middle class semblance of sanity, right? Moderates, not wanting to move the revolution further out in the direction of redistribution of property and radical socialist economic changes, done by at gunpoint. So the tables are now turned on the Jacobins, and you'd think, okay, we finally are at an end to the crazy violence, but not so fast, because, and you can probably see what's coming, now it's time for revenge against the Jacobins. And so they're hunted down, and they're put on trial, and many of them are executed as well. Not all, but many of them. So even the Thermidorian reaction, though it resulted in, something that brought some semblance of normality and a conventional government back into place, it was still violent and bloody. And last, but certainly not least, we get to Gracchus Babeuf. We've talked about this revolution ushering in modern socialism, and there had already been some signs of it, and there's things we skipped that were already of a socialist nature that contributed to this revolution. Some we talked about, some we haven't. But this is, I think, the biggest example of it. And this comes at the very end. This comes during the Thermidorian reaction, as the government known as the Directory, which was a leadership group of 5, so it wasn't democracy, it was a sober, sort of respectable group of 5 leaders, I can't speak, who took power under the Directory, but it wasn't a democracy because it wasn't an elected legislature that was making the policies and carrying out the law. It was these 5 guys. But Gracchus Babeuf was a editor of a newspaper of his own called the Tribune of the People. Gracchus, right, is a reference to the Gracchi brothers in ancient Rome, who were tribunes of the people in Rome. So he clearly saw himself as a Roman tribune, because that wasn't his real name. That was an assumed name, Gracchus. He was a local government leader for a time, again, editor of a small newspaper. He advocated democracy and the absolute abolition of private property. Those two things don't go together as well as you might think. In fact, they don't go together at all. We won't get into that. But during 1794, 1795, he started hatching a plot with other socialist leaders or agitators, political activists, to try to overthrow the Directory, which was the existing government of France by that time. The plot, known as the Conspiracy of Equals, was foiled before it got underway, and he was put on trial, was eventually found guilty and executed along with some of the others. But some of his statements at trial are telling about not only his views, but socialist views of the time. He said, "We've only been dreaming of the happiness of our fellow creatures. The revolution has become a new religion, and we long for the day when the great principle of equality would become the sole religion of the peoples. No member of the community should be able to possess anything other than that which the law makes available through the agency of the government. The movement of workers from one locale to another may be ordered by the administration." He means his administration once the socialist group takes power, "in light of the needs and resources of the community." So he starts by kind of dreaming about a better, happy future where everybody's equal. But in that same statement, and he's saying this at his trial in his own defense, which obviously backfired, but no member of the community should be able to possess anything than other what the government says they can own. The government can be able to, will be able to move people around at will. You need to move out of this town, I'll move to that one. Right? This is where we can see, I think, that socialism and democracy don't coincide, even though he didn't believe that. He also said, "Society must be made to operate in such a way that it eradicates once and for all the desire of a man to become richer or wiser or more powerful than others," which also is in some ways typically socialist, what later would become Marxist, in that there's a real, not only social engineering element to socialist thought and activity, but there's a sort of human engineering element here, that they believe they can change human nature. We're just going to, all we have to do is just change human beings from the way they are now to the way we want them to be, and socialism will work perfectly, which is telling about how well they even thought it would work, or at least unconsciously maybe thought. The evidence, among other evidence against Babeuf and his co-conspirators, was the Insurrectionary Act, which was basically a pamphlet they put out and spread pretty widely, so there were lots of them around for the authorities to get a hold of. They kind of spelled out their orders, their plans, what they were doing. In one part it says, "No one may leave Paris without a formal and special order. All opposition shall be suppressed immediately by force. Those opposing shall be exterminated." So this is harsh language stemming from a harsh ideology. At least that way of thinking about socialism was extreme. I would argue, again, this is my viewpoint, could be wrong, but that socialism inevitably leads in that direction anyway, if it's sort of around for long enough. It has a tendency to move in that direction. So sometimes Babeuf is referred to today as the first revolutionary communist, which I don't think is really out of line. So certainly he was an extreme socialist, even if, whether I'm right or wrong about it being inevitable that it eventually moves in that direction. Well, I'm not going to get into that. We're at the end anyway. Have a good day or evening, whatever it is, at your locale. Take care.